Hello, I'm Brad Slominski, and I'm happy to welcome you to our Dental Crafters DC Academy, an online educational video program developed by our team for doctors and their staff. In this section, we will talk about shade taking and walk through the light and color concepts, factors that determine proper shade taking, shade guides, camera settings, and common mistakes. If you have any questions after reviewing the video, please don't hesitate to contact us at 1-800-472-8302. We hope you enjoy your learning experience. Our objectives in this learning video will be how to set up the office environment, surroundings, and lighting, learn about communicating in color using value, hue, and chroma, understand Vita 3D Master Shade Guide and the Vita Classical Shade Guide, learn the 3-step shade taking process using the 3D Master Shade Guide, comprehend the information needed for the laboratory, discuss what to do or not to do when taking pictures with a digital SLR camera. So when we discuss the concepts of shade taking in the operatory, it all starts with the light. Could you imagine being in a dark cave without any light? What do you see? You don't see any color. It's completely black. So we have to use artificial lighting in our operatories to illuminate the colors that we actually see. So light bulbs are a key factor in seeing that color. Most operatories use some type of a fluorescent 4-foot light bulb to illuminate, and that's actually what we recommend. Any type of incandescence light bulbs, as you see here, generally don't come in a color corrected, but fluorescents are very popular in having color corrected lighting. What we're looking at in a light bulb is a light bulb that has what they call 5500 Kelvin and 91 CRI. Now, sounds like layman's terms, not real common that are used, but when we start to study light bulbs, which we will in the next few slides, I think you'll start to wrap your head around what we're looking for. And bottom line is, when you're shopping for light bulbs, when you call your manufacturer and you want to just request a Kelvin rating of 5500 and a 91 CRI. Now, what we are trying to replicate with artificial lighting is we're really trying to replicate natural lighting. So studies have been done for years of what natural lighting is. I mean, it changes. From one day you could have a dark, gloomy, cloudy day, and the next day it's a bright, sunny day. So natural light illuminates different rays of color: yellow, reds, blues, and greens. So what we're trying to do is we're really trying to match natural lighting between 10 and 11 and 2 and 3, they say, is the most neutral lighting that there is, and that is 5500 Kelvin, measured on a bright, sunshiny day, cloud-free. Between those times of the day, 5500 Kelvin is what we're trying to replicate to give us that neutral lighting. As you can see on this chart, the 5500 mark, it's a little bit more on that bluer side of things. As you start to drop in the chart and you get down around that 4000, notice how it's more of that standard clear. As you drop further into that 3000, it gets to be more on the yellow side. So at 5500, it's actually pretty much in the middle of the chart. So you still get a good combination of the dark blues, the reds, the oranges. That's what we're looking for, and that's what we refer to as neutral lighting. So let's elaborate on the different lighting that you can get for Kelvin ratings. Let's reference the first chart. If you look at a light bulb that has a Kelvin rating of 2700 to 3000 Kelvin, it's more that warmer light. And as you can see in the picture below, it's a very soothing, relaxing, generally used in homes, lobbies, restaurants. It's more of that yellowish, calming effect. If you reference the next chart, it's 3500 to 3900 Kelvin. It's more of that neutral light. Supermarkets, showrooms, you see how it's a little bit brighter. The next reference would be the 4100 plus. Now you're starting to get a little bit more on that bluer side. It's more of that cool color. It adds the blues and the whites and the greens, which kind of dull the reds and enhances the blues. So that is now we're starting to get into element where we're starting to pick up more of the color spectrum. And that's what we're looking for in that 5500, is to pull some of that color out of the teeth so we see the reds, the blues, and the greens. Now that you understand a little bit of the concept of what type of light we're looking for, let's talk a little bit about the longevity of the light. Once you put a light bulb in a fixture, it immediately starts to expend its life expectancies. So when you put it in, don't just assume the light is good 2 or 3 years later because the light is still working, it's still illuminating. It does slowly start to lose its color over time. We recommend, to stay current, is to replace your color-corrected light bulbs once every year. Now that doesn't mean you have to throw them in the garbage, but the operatories that you're taking your shade in, take them out once a year and rotate those into the hygiene bays or rotate them into your front office area or your break room. It's still a good bulb in those locations because it still illuminates light. We just want to have good, fresh color spectrum lights. So again, recommending changing the light bulbs in your operatories every year. So now that we understand that we need light or a light source in the operatory to be able to illuminate and see color, we're now going to use the eye. So now we have to be able to train you and to understand what does the eye see and how do we reference that and communicate that to the laboratory. So before we go even further, let's talk a little bit about who is or is not colorblind. Interesting statistics is 1 in every 13 males are color deficient. Very interesting because both my children, they're 15 and 17, they're both colorblind. Unfortunately, they get that from their mother. She is actually colorblind. So 1 in every 300 females are color deficient, so my wife happens to be one of those 300 females. So one test that you can take, if you look at this next chart, you'll notice on the left side, you should see a number. Do you see a number? If you don't, there's a good chance that you're probably colorblind. If you do see a number, that number should be number 45. If you look on the right side, you also should see a number. If you only see dots, again, there's a good chance you're colorblind. If you do see a number, that number should be the number 8. If you see the numbers, then good to go. We should be good to proceed and do some further training on proper shade taking. So we kind of covered the light bulb. We kind of covered the understanding of our eye needs to be basically the judgment and the reference of understanding the color. We know you're not colorblind now because you saw the 45 and the number 8 number. Now let's roll into the environment, the color environment. So let's reference the chart that you see. You'll see 2 small orange squares on the right and the left side of the screen. The one on the left side has a surrounding color of yellow and orange, and the one on the right has a surrounding color of a dark blue and a lighter blue. My question to you are those 2 small orange squares, are they the same color? Do they look the same color? I would assume you're about to say no, because the left one and the right one do look a little bit different. But as you see, when I take away the 2 surrounding colors and I only leave those 2 orange squares, now what do you see? They look exactly the same. But the prior screen, they did not. It's trickery. What I'm trying to say is the color that surrounds the orange squares has an influence of what you see. So now let's relate that to the operatory. If you have a patient that comes in and they're wearing that blouse or the lipstick, that changes what you see in color. So good basic fundamentals of understanding what colors are around you influences what you actually see. Now let's reference that same concept with shade guides. As you see here, I have 6 pictures that I have taken with the same exact shade guide, a 2M1, a 3M1, and a 4M1. Now let's hone in on the 4M1 shade guide. When you look at the colors, the background colors that are behind them, you'll notice that the background color with the gray background, notice how the 4M1 shade guide has a lot of color in it. Then reference the top right one, which is the dark blue color background. Notice how that 4M1 also has a very good color to the shade guide. Now look at all the other shade guides. Look at the black, look at the yellow, the green, and the red, and reference that 4M1 shade guide. You notice how there's not as much color saturation in it? Now I didn't trick you. That's actually the same shade guide. But my point is that the light gray or the blue background is a neutral colored background. So therefore you see more true colors. Now ironically, most operatories that I'm in, you'll notice that the bibs that are used for the patient when you're working on a procedure tend to be a light gray or a light blue color, which is the perfect color to block out any red t-shirts or red shirts or any other color that might have a negative influence on the color that you see. So take note that light gray and a blue color is the best surrounding color to take shades. Now that you understand how the background color influences how we see shade, let's talk about how we start to communicate shade. So now we're going to get into how you start to reference what you see on an RX form, and we communicate that back to the laboratory. So the first and the very most important element of shade taking is value. Now, value is the amount of gray intensity that you see in the tooth. So if you see the gradient chart at the very top, on the very left it's white, and as you slowly slide to the right, you start to see a gradient or more scale of gray all the way till you get to black. Now let me give you a reference in the operatory. Let's say you have a crown and you get it back and you try the crown in, and it is really, really bright in the patient's mouth. And a doctor will look at you and say, wow, it looks like a headlight. It's really bright. That is a high valued crown. So it's too white or too far left on the spectrum of value. Now let's take another for instance. You put a crown in and it's really dead in the mouth. It just looks dead. It dies. It's really gray. It's really low in value. That would be sliding towards the right side of the scale. So it's too gray, it's too low in value. The next element of color communication is going to be hue. Now, hue is the actual color that you see. So if you reference the chart that is in front of you, you'll see the colors of red, orange, brown, and yellow. That's the dominant color that you see. The next form of communication is going to be chroma. Now, chroma is the element of the amount of pigmentation or color saturation that you actually see. If you notice the scale in front of you, you'll see a gradient scale. Note the right side of this gradient scale. The color that you see is orange. That's the hue that we're talking about. As you slide to the left, you're going to see less color pigmentation of that orange. That's chroma. The hue is still orange, but as you slide to that left, you have less color pigmentation, so it's a lighter colored orange. Here's another chart to help you reference chroma. All the colors that you see here are red. So again, that is the hue that you see is red. But as you notice, from top to bottom, that you start to get higher in chroma or color saturation as you go down further on the chart towards the bottom. You can even mix value into that. So as you see in the top scale, from left to right, you'll notice there is a value. So every color can carry a certain amount of grayness to it. So far left, it's on the darker side, and as you move to the right, you get higher value or less gray. So now that you understand the basic communication skills, we talked about value, we talked about hue, and we talked about chroma. Another element of shade taking is understanding what Mother Nature has done to our teeth, or maybe what we've done to our teeth through tobacco or coffee. There are different factors such as stain crack lines, white decalcification markings. This isn't a real easy way, and it doesn't help you take the shade. What we're looking at and when we take shade is we need a baseline. We need a base shade of that tooth. But obviously, we have to put the crack lines and the white decalcification lines in if we're trying to match that to an adjacent tooth. The best way to document that will be through digital photography, which we'll talk about in a few more slides. But when you're taking the shade, you need to kind of block those white areas out in your mind and look at that base shade behind and make sure you still pick that shade, and then we'll reference the crack lines and the white decalcification lines either through a drawing on the RX form or better yet, a digital picture. Another reference that you have to take into account when taking a shade is the surface texture of the tooth that you're working on. As you notice here is a tab of porcelain. On the right side, we sandblasted the tab and we made it dull. On the left side, we kept the shine or the glaze on it, so it has a shiny atmosphere or shiny look to it. Now look at the difference when you're looking at that. It's the same color, but it's because of the reflectivity of the surface that it makes it look higher or brighter in value. So make sure you position the patient's head or the lighting source so that you don't get that reflection on the surface, so you see true color. The next reference I'd like to show you would be actually on a tooth. So as you see on these two incisors, on the left you have a very, very natural or young or youthful looking tooth. So look at the different imbrication lines that we have on that surface texture. On the right side, you're going to have a tooth that's got a little more age to it, and it's a lot smoother. Now, how do we reference that? What does that mean to us? Really, it means that a good quality impression will show whether or not we have a heavy imbrication, heavy surface texture, or if we have the smooth texture. Also backing that up with a good quality digital picture does also reference that for us, so we can start to build those surface textures in to the artificial tooth that we're working on so we can blend it into the natural teeth. Now that you understand some elements of taking the shade, environment, lighting, communication, some surface texture, now we need to talk about the tool that you're going to use to pick the shade and communicate that back to the laboratory. So the first and very common shade guide, it's been around for many, many years, is the Vita Classical Shade Guide. Comes in shades from A1 to D4, very commonly used. The A's are kind of the reddish brown, the B's are kind of the reddish yellow, the C's are more on that grayish greenish gray, and the D's are more of the reddish gray. I want to reference another shade guide, the 3D Master Shade Guide. Now this shade guide is an excellent shade guide on how to communicate back to the laboratory the shade that you're actually trying to achieve. Now, as you notice on the left side of the shade guide, there is an add-on shade guide. It does come with the shade guide when you purchase it, but it's called a bleach shade guide. So obviously that's for the teeth that are really white, bleached out. But it comes with a vast array of different shade guides. Now, don't be intimidated by this. We're going to now work on how do we break down the selection of a shade using this shade guide. And this is why I like it, because this is a fundamental process of elimination shade guide. So let's get into that. This next picture, you're going to see the same shade guide, the Vita 3D Master Shade Guide, and it's grayscaled out. So now you don't see any color. So that takes the element of hue and chroma out. But what does it leave? It leaves value only. Now, value is the most important element of picking a shade. If we pick the value and the value is correct and it comes back from the laboratory with the value correct, the hue and the chroma can be slightly off and it's still going to be accepted by the doctor and the patient. If the value is off, that is generally where most of your remakes come from. So the reason I like using the 3D Master Shade Guide is because it's a value-based shade guide. Now let's go back to the Vita Classical Shade Guide. Now if you notice here that there is no rhyme or reason to the colors here. If you look at the very far left, which is an A1, look at the brightness. Does it look brighter than A2 that's next door to the right of it? It should. Now look at A2 in reference to the next shade guide. They look about the same color of gray. A35, the fourth one over, is a little bit darker. A4 is a little bit darker than that. Now B1 goes lighter again. Then B2 goes darker. My concept here is that there's no rhyme or reason to how this shade guide was oriented. They were random colors picked. So how you choose or use this tool on picking a shade is a little bit more difficult unless you're just randomly trying to pick the color that best matches. Now if you reference back to the 3D shade guide, the 3D shade guide actually is oriented by value. So what I mean by that is if you look at that bleach shade guide that I referenced on the far left side, the bleach shade guide is a OM shade, or OM1, OM2, OM3. All of those shade guides are the same amount of gray. You cannot tell the difference between them. As you move to the right of the shade guide, you're going to notice a 1M bracket. That 1M, there's a 1M1 and a 1M2. Those two shade guides are the same amount of gray, but they are darker or grayer than the O shade guide, and so forth as we move to the right. The bracket of the 2 shade guide. Now I have a 2L, a 2M, and a 2R. You're going to notice that that 2 group, you cannot tell the difference between those shade guides when I take the color and the chroma away, and you only see value. They all look the same. Interesting part with the shade guide is they separate the grayscale in between each value group by what we call 7 diopters. Now that's an optometrist terminology, but basically they found that you cannot differentiate anything less than 7 diopters in color. So by having these groups spaced 7 diopters apart, that gives the laboratory the ability to actually be able to mix a 1M and a 2M color and end up with an in-between value or shade. Very unique to the system. We cannot do that with a Vita Classical shade guide. So let's get a little bit further in detail on how we're going to utilize this shade guide and communicate it back. Now let's reference the shade guide and how we use it in picking value. Again, we're talking value only. I don't care about the color of the tooth. We don't care about the hue and the chroma. All I care about is when I'm referencing the shade guide, is the shade tab that I'm referencing to the tooth bright or dark compared to the tooth, or is it perfect? So the process of elimination is the best match. So we're going to commence this by darkest first, then go lighter to match the target tooth, and then we're going to use a best to worst principle in selection. So what I'm saying is you can actually take the shade guide, and if you notice, there are 6 shade tabs that are the tallest, the highest shade tabs. Now, a lot of doctors will actually take all the other shades out and only leave those tall shade tabs in there. So you really have a choice of one of 6. So you're going to have a choice of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0. So 6 shade tabs. You're going to hold the 5 shade tab up first to the tooth you're matching and ask yourself, is the 5 shade tab darker than the tooth you're trying to match? Is it grayer or is it brighter? I would assume you're going to say it's grayer. 5 is a very dark and a very gray shade. Then you want to go down to the 4. Is the 4M1? Is it bright or is it dark in reference to the natural tooth you're selecting? Go down to the 3. Ask yourself the question again. Is it bright or is it dark compared to the tooth that I'm matching? Again, as a reminder, you're looking at the value, so the amount of gray intensity. Don't get caught up in if it's orange or red or greenish. You just want to worry about, is it bright or is it dark in reference to the natural tooth? So you slide down that shade guide until you find the right value that matches the natural tooth. Once you pick that value, if you've stopped on the 2 value group, now all we care about is the 2 value group. We don't care about any of the other shade guides. That's what we mean by process of elimination. You've just eliminated all the other shade groups and honed it down to just a 2 value group. From there, we move on to selecting hue and chroma. So to reference the importance of choosing value first, you're going to see here where we fade in a tooth that is too high in value. And notice when that tooth fades in, see how bright it looks? It looks high in value in comparison to the adjacent central. Then we're going to fade in another picture where we darkened it. It looks low in value compared to the natural central. Then we're going to fade back in to the proper shade, which is the natural looking tooth. You notice how you start to pick whether it's bright or whether it's dark, and we're not worrying about those other color spectrums of hue and chroma. You really need to hone in on this and make sure that you're picking that proper shade, that proper value. Now, referencing this next slide, you'll see on the left picture where we took out all of the other shade tabs other than the value group. So we have an OM, a 1M, a 2M, a 3M, a a 4M and a 5M shade tabs in there, and all the other ones we took out just to make this more simplified. And you're welcome to do this in the operatory too if you have a spare shade guide. Now, all we're referencing is those top shade tabs. And again, referencing for value only, not worrying about hue or chroma. So again, asking yourself, is it bright or is it dark? So now let's dig into detail a little bit more about the shade guide. So now we talked about value. At the top of that shade guide again, you'll see the light to the dark. So from left to right, we go from the higher valued shade to the darker or lower valued shade as you get closer to the 5s. Now when we're going to talk a little bit about hue and chroma, how do we select those using the shade guide? Hue, as you notice in the bottom of shade guide, we have L is for a yellow hue, M is for an orange hue, and R is for the red hue. Now let's reference the value group 2. So the value group 2, you have a 2L, you have a 2M, and you have a 2R. So you notice consistently the first number 2 references the value group. So all of those shade guides are the value group 2, all the same amount of gray coloration or gray saturation. The L is what we reference as those two shade tabs. There's a 2L 1.5 and a 2L 2.5. Those reference the yellowish hue. Then the middle shade guide is the 2M. Now there's a 2M1, a 2M2, and a 2M3. All of those have M's in it. And what's consistent about M is they are on the orange hue side. Then the shade tab to the right is a 2R. There's a 2R 1.5 and a 2R 2.5. The R is again consistent. The R has more of a reddish hue in those shade guides. Now reference the gradient scale on the right side, where we talk about low saturation and high saturation. So referencing back to that 2M1, the 2M1 versus the 2M2, as you go from the top of the shade guide and you go down, so from 2M1 to 2M2, and then from 2M2 to 2M3, we're talking about chroma or color saturation. So the 2M1 is exact same hue as the 2M2 because they both have an orange hue. But the difference between the two tabs is 2M2 has more color pigmentation of orange than what the 2M1 does. And hence the 2M3 has more color pigmentation or more chroma than what the 2M2 has. And that's how we pick our chroma, is going from the top of the shade guide down the shade guide. Now we spent a lot of time on value. We briefly just spoke about how we use the shade guide with chroma and hue, and I'd like to break that down a little bit further just to clarify any misunderstanding. Now in this slide I referenced the chroma selection. So I pulled out a 3M1 shade tab. What we mean by color saturation at chroma is basically the 3M1 has less chroma than the 3M2. So if you look at those two colors, the M is still an orange hue, but as I go down from 3M1 to 3M2 to 3M3, we have an increased chroma saturation or an increased in orange color. So that is referenced back to the shade guide itself. As you look back to the shade guide, you'll see that from the top of the shade guide going down, no matter what shade tab you pick, you are going down or intensifying the chroma the further down the shade guide that you go. Now the next element I'd like to break down a little more would be the hue selection. So again, the median or orangish hue would be the M hue. The yellowish hue was going to be the L hue, and the R is going to be the red hue. So it's hard to tell this in the pictures there, but when you hold each one of these shade tabs up, I always start with the M shade first, knowing that it's the orange hue. And you ask yourself, what do I see in reference to the natural tooth? Is it more red than the 3M shade guide, or is it more yellow than the 3M shade tab? And that's what we mean by better, fair, or worse principle, is you're always asking yourself which one looks better in reference to the natural tooth, knowing you have three options: an orange hue, a yellow hue, or a red hue. So now that we talked about the three elements of hue, value, and chroma, I just want to make sure that there's a clear understanding of what the numbers on the shade tabs themselves are. So we're referencing a 2M1 shade tab here. So the number 2 is the value group. The letter M is the hue group, so that's the orange hue group. And the number 1 is the chroma group. So that would be consistent if we went to a 2M2. The 2 would be a value, the M is still the hue, and the 2 would be the chroma. So that's how you start to understand how the shade tabs are oriented. Now VIDA has come out with a new shade concept. This is it's a value guide or the linear shade guide. This is the exact same shade guide we were just referencing. It's the 3D Master Shade Guide. But what they did is they pulled the shade tabs out and made it more simplified and easier for you to use chairside to be able to choose the right shade. Now, if you notice the top left picture where it's got the darker gray plastic, notice that there's a 0M2 all the way up to a 5M2. And what they did is they took all of those top shade tabs out of that other shade guide, and they put them in a value group shade guide. So this was your first selection. This is the first thing you're going to grab out of this linear shade guide is this shade tab. And you're going to hold that up in reference to the natural tooth, trying to pick the value group only. Again, the amount of gray intensity that the natural tooth has in reference to this shade tab. Once you pick that value group, that's where you'll reach into the other 5 shade tabs, and you're going to grab either the 0 or the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, or the 5 value tab, and then we're going to move on to choosing the hue and the chroma out of that shade tab. So as you can see, it's less daunting, it's a little more organized, a little more simplified, and since value is our very most important thing to pick on a shade, you'll notice that's why we use a value group first, and it has those eliminated from all the other shade tabs, and it makes things a little bit more focused to the eye. So if I was to pick a shade guide to purchase, this would be the one that I would purchase. Those are available at Dental Crafters by contacting us at 1-800-472-8302, or you can order directly from VIDA. Either way, it's a great tool for you to have. I hope you were bearing with me through that whole process of philosophy of understanding how to pick a shade. Now we want to get right down to the fundamentals of picking a shade. We're going to break this down into a 3-step process. So you can imagine the 3-step process. The very first thing we're going to do is we're going to pick value, because as we said all along here, that the value is the most important thing to pick. So we're going to take as step 1 is picking value. Again, light to dark. Step 2 is going to be picking the hue. So we're going to be picking the orange, the red, or the yellow. Step 3 is going to be picking that chroma, so the amount of color saturation that you have within that hue. So let's break that down. And I took some oral pictures here so that you can kind of follow through on how we pick our shade guides. So in this instance, I did use the value or the linear shade tab. And you're going to notice that I am looking at a 5M2 in reference to the natural tooth. Now I cheated a little bit and I took the color out for you. So the only thing you can reference here is the amount of gray, because when you're looking at this shade tab, I want you to start taking that color out in your mind and only looking in the amount of gray intensity that you see in that shade tab in reference to the tooth. So what do you see? Obviously, it's way too dark, so low in value. So now let's move down the scale and let's look in reference to the 4M2 shade tab. Now what do you see there compared to that natural tooth? Obviously, same thing, too gray, too low in value. And we're going to keep sliding down that shade tab. 3M1 or 3M2. What do you see there? I still think that's too low in value. It's too gray. So we slide down to the 2M2. Now we're starting to get an element where I think we're getting close. Now look at that value. It's starting to look pretty good, but I never stop there. I always want to go past it just to confirm it with my own eyes. And I like to go past that down to a 1M1 just to clarify. Now, if you notice that shade tab, it looks too high in value. It starts to look too bright. So what does that tell you? Our 2M2 is definitely going to be our pick for our value. As you move down the scale further, you're going to see the OM2. Obviously, if our 1M1 was too bright, our OM2 is going to be even brighter. And that just really confirms to us back to where we want to be, that it's too high in value. So we're going to home back in and say, okay, for tooth number 8, we choose the 2M2 shade guide. So that's our value group. Do you see the process of elimination? Now that we talked about how to pick the value and we settled on a value group 2, let's talk about the next step. So step 2 is how do we pick our hue and chroma. So let's start with our hue. So we know we picked a value group 2. So if you notice on the upper right, you're going to see a picture of the shade tab or the shade guide that I'm using. Now remember, this is a 3D Master shade guide in a linear form that we're referencing. So I'm going to grab the value group 2 shade guide. As you noticed, I held a 2M1 in reference to the natural tooth. And we know that the 2M is an orange hue. So my question to you is, what do you see in that shade tab in reference to the natural tooth? Does it look pretty good? Not too bad. Hard to pick it apart. Now let's, as a reference, look at the next shade tab as a 2M or 2L 1.5. Now what do you see? You know that the L stands for yellow. Now notice you start to see, now that you know there's yellow in the 2L, notice how the shade tab looks a little more yellow. Now reference the natural tooth. What do you see? Does it look too yellow? Now let's reference the next shade tab. That's going to be the R shade tab. So the 2R 1.5. And again, you know the R stands for red. Now do you start to see the red coming out in that shade tab? In reference to the natural tooth, what do you see? Does it look good? Does it look bad? That's your process of elimination. So now, in that process of elimination, I pick what I think is my best. I really thought 2M1 had about the best match. So let's reference that in a photo where you can see all 3 photos together. So let's look at, from left to right, the 2M shade guide. So we have a 2M1. Again, comparing that to the natural tooth, I think it looks pretty good. If you look at the middle shade or middle picture, the 2L, we know there's yellow in that shade tab. I think it's too yellow. I don't see that natural tooth. Now, when we look at the far right one, the 2R, which we know is red, you really start to see the red come out in that shade tab. So, and I don't see that natural tooth. So I really hone back on to the 2M1 is going to be my pick. So now we picked the value group 2. We picked our hue group of an M. So 2M1 is the shade tab that we're looking at. Now what's the last thing we have to pick is chroma. We know we're in that M series, in that orange series. Now why don't we look at reference of a 2M2? So still value group 2, the hue group of an M or orange. And when you look at the number 2 as the intensified chroma. Now let's reference this shade tab. Look at how the 2M2 looks like there's too much color. See that chroma intensification coming out? See how the orange starts to pop more? And if you reference that to the natural tooth, you can definitely tell that if we pick that shade, it would be a given remake, and none of us want to have that. So we definitely picked a natural shade here of a 2M1 shade guide. So I hope that we broke that down in a step-by-step process of a step 1 being value, a step 2 being the hue, and a step 3 would be the chroma. And that's how easy this shade guide is to be able to pick the proper shade and be able to communicate that to the laboratory. Now, another thing to think about is what if you're between 2 shades? What if you think it's value group 2 is a little too dark, value group 1 is a little bit too light. Well, you can document that in the RX form and with a digital camera and let us know that. And because the way the shade guide is manufactured, between a space of 7 diopters in between each shade tab, we can actually systematically mix two porcelains together and give you a given in between shade, which is very unique to this system. That's why at Dental Crafters we really endorse using the 3D Master Shade Guide. It's a phenomenal tool for you to communicate color back to the laboratory. It gives us the ability then to be able to mix and match porcelains together so that we really truly give you the best quality product possible. To enhance that even further, I'd like to get a little bit of this presentation and talk about cameras and how we use digital cameras in communicating that color to the laboratory. So now we have a good reference on how to pick a shade. Again, let's talk about documentation for the laboratory and even for your reference, for your case records on the patient. We do this through a digital camera. Now, the digital camera that I'm going to be referencing here is really called an SLR digital camera. This is not your conventional point and shoot cameras that you're going to pick up from the local department store. This is going to be a full functional SLR Canon or Nikon type camera. Now, what I want to reference here on camera settings is you see this is a Rebel XS EOS with a Sigma macro lens and a Sigma flash. Now, what does that mean? It basically means this is a Rebel, it's a Canon camera, that's the camera body, and we use a macro lens in order to zoom in and see good detail on teeth. And then we have to use some type of a ring flash or light source that is close to the tooth or close to the mouth to illuminate the oral cavity. The conventional flash that the camera has just does not illuminate enough light on this. As you see here, the photo that we have referenced here shows that same exact thing where you see the camera ring flash, the longer macro lens with the camera body. Now we're going to reference where you can buy these types of cameras in a few more slides. But at this point, I'd like to reference the picture that we want to take. Now, this is a great picture to give to the laboratory. So that is a picture of my lovely wife, Mindy. She's referencing here as a model for us. But that picture there basically shows from the top of the head to the bottom of the chin is a full face picture. Now, what does this picture really make relevant to the laboratory? Well, it really helps us understand the shape of the face. So let's, for instance, talk about a denture case. If I don't know what tooth to pick, and I'm just going to randomly pick a tooth based off of the oral cavity arch that you gave me, I may pick too square of a tooth for a patient. So on Mindy here, she has a little bit more of that tapered ovoid face. I wouldn't want to grab a real boxy square tooth and set that in the denture setup because the tooth would look too aggressive. It'd look too square. So we like to see these types of pictures, particularly on the removable side and even on the fixed side, just to understand what tooth shape we're trying to match to the face. Now, when you talk about the camera settings, on the second picture from the right, you'll see the f-stop is 5.6. And on this particular lens, we set the lens setting of a 1.5. And then we're going to use the camera mode. We're going to be on AV mode. Now, each camera is different. In this segment, I'm not going to talk about a lot of detail of Canon versus Nikon. My point of reference really is to understand the piece of equipment that you have. In order to take this picture, you're going to need a good quality camera. You're going to need to understand the f-stop. You're going to need to understand how do you function with the lens setting and what mode the camera should be under. And roughly to take this picture, you're going to be about 5 to 6 feet away. Now, a little more extensive training. This doesn't take long, but we do need to work with the office on, the camera and how to function this. And that would be another great element that we're going to add into our DC Academy in future videos of actually how to function with these cameras and how to take these pictures. So you can look forward to that. The next picture that you'll see here that we like to see from a laboratory aspect is going to be a full smile picture. So it's kind of from buccal corridor to buccal corridor. So again, to take this picture, we're roughly 18 inches away from the front of the face to the front of the lens in the camera. We're going to be on an f-stop of 32. You notice how the lens setting changed. The reason the lens setting changed is because we're trying to get a little less data. We don't want the full face here. We're trying to zoom in and just get the teeth. And you'll notice all of these pictures we're going to use in camera mode of AV. Another great picture and reference. So we start to understand, again, the plane of occlusion, curva Spee, curva Wilson, we can kind of see in reference in these types of pictures. The next picture that you're going to see here is an up-close picture. Phenomenal picture to have, where we basically are going to zoom all the way in with the lens. We're still on f-stop 32, still on camera mode AV. We're only 4 inches away. Now you notice that the closer, the less detail, or I should say the less information that we have in a picture, and we start to zoom closer in on the patient, you notice how you're closer to the patient. So here we're only 4 inches from the front of the patient's face to the front of the lens. And this picture is phenomenal for just showing absolute detail in the teeth that we're trying to match. Very, very highly used photo daily in the laboratory. Now, this particular photo is the one I want to reference the most. All of the information we talked prior in this video was how to select a good proper shade. Now we need to document it. Now look at the photo that I took. Notice how the shade tab is right below the tooth that we're trying to match. It's not behind it, and it's not in front of it. It has to be in the same profile. Notice how the shade tab, the metal part, we bend to the side. The reason we bend that to the side is the most translucent part of the shade tab is in the incisal part of the shade tab. And if we have a gray metal below that, it's going to change the reference or the value of that shade tab through that most translucent part. So by bending it to the side gives us a better chance of maintaining proper value without having the metal influence. But notice how we have our lens setting so we just catch the edge of the tab. I just see the number 2. So I see the 1M2. If I zoom in too far, you would cut off a 2 or cut off a 1, and I wouldn't be able to see what shade tab that is. If you zoom out too far, I start to lose detail in the picture. So you notice that it's not touching the incisal part of the tooth the way it's being held. It's just below it. Now, if you have a hard time holding the camera and the shade tab at the same time, you may need 2 assistants in the operatory. One assistant is bending that shade tab and to the side, the metal part, holding the shade tab just below the tooth that we're trying to match. Again, trying to match. So you can imagine if we're trying to do a number 6 is the crown we're making, you might be or should be referencing number 11 on the opposite side of the arch, so that 6 and 11 match. So kind of think about that when you're picking a shade. So I hope that helps you on the proper way of documenting the photo of the shade that you've picked for the patient. I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about the detail photos or detail we can get in the photos. And just to kind of reference how important these are, when you zoom in on a single tooth and give us the data that we need, you can see that we can start to see the detail. And if you reference this photo, you'll see that where I drew a blue line on the central to the right, everything below that I see more of a bluish translucency. Because you gave me a detailed photo that was really zoomed in, I can see that characterization. That's where a ceramist can reach into the drawer where we have many different bottles of colors of porcelain, and we can build that effect into that type of into that crown. Notice the central to the left has the little orange effect, kind of dead central, the incisal edge. And again, we see that detail from that photo. This next photo you'll see kind of the same thing. Look at the mesial and distal interproximals. You'll see kind of that bluish translucency. To me as a ceramist in the porcelain that I use, I see a double E9, which is a particular porcelain that gives me that effect. Now I can choose that only because I see that. Now dead center, you kind of see that area highlighted. It kind of has more of a bluish opal effect. Well, that's an opal porcelain, so I would pick opal porcelain. So you see the detail that this starts to give us. Now you reference that with a good shade guide picture. You really arm the laboratory with all the tools that we need for success. Basically to give that patient a rock star type appliance or a prosthetic that they're really proud of and you and I are very proud of. And that's how we grow our businesses. Now here's another photo that'll kind of bring this home. We talked about different porcelains that we can use in the laboratory. Now this is a picture of us building a ceramic tooth. Now you notice on the tooth that we're working on, porcelain comes in different powders, and we can layer and stack different powders. Now look at the central to your left. See the effects that we were able to build in. See the different mamelon effects, the different translucencies, the different oranges. Now, is this reality? Are you going to see this in that effect in a natural tooth? It might be a little extreme, but the moral of the story is if you give us a detailed photo and we see those subtle nuances in natural teeth, it gives us the ability of building that in because we can hand layer each individual bit of porcelain to make that effect. So I hope that truly helps an understanding of what you can provide the laboratory and the detail that we can actually really help you be more successful in your practice. Now let's talk about some other photos. The other reason that investment into a good SLR camera would be just good documentation. Now we're talking about your hygienists that are listening. Hygiene, to be able to document cases when a new patient walks in the door and to be able to pull this and put it into case records that maybe 5 or 10 years down the road, you pull those old photos up and maybe you show the patient when they first started to meet with you at some of the wear that's happened over the next 10 years, or where they were versus where they are today. That really helps them. It helps you position yourself in showing them options for them, or maybe rebuilding or restoring cases. So some of the photos we see here again are the full face photos, that full smile photo that we talked about, good documentation, good occlusal views. Now here'd be another add-on or a purchase that you need to make of some good occlusal mirrors. A little bit tricky on taking these, but you're really taking a picture of the mirror, not necessarily of the arch, using a little bit of air and blowing it on the mirror to keep any of the steam off of it. Buccal corridor pictures for right and left lateral, showing wear for the patient. Great documentation. Also for Invisalign, I believe they require an awful lot of that. Some common mistakes I'd like to discuss with you on taking photos would be when we're trying to document these types of items for the laboratory, there are mistakes that we can make and that are quite common in making. And here's referencing a 2-in-1 shade tab. As you notice the area by the incisal edge of the natural tooth, see how the shade tab's behind the tooth. Now what if that incisal edge of that natural tooth was very, very crystal clear translucent edge, and now we threw a colored shade tab behind it? I wouldn't see that effect anymore. That's why you want to be at the same profile, just barely below the incisal edge of the tooth, not up behind it. And also reference the incisal edge of the shade guide itself. The lower incisors are actually influencing the natural translucency of that. So you definitely wouldn't want to have that type of picture. Here's a common mistake that happens quite often, is the shade tab's out in front of the tooth. Now look at what it does and see how it casts a shadow on the natural tooth that we're actually trying to match. So we talked about value being the most important element of shade taking. Obviously, by casting a shadow from the shade tab, it's going to lower the value of that natural tooth. So therefore, your shade tab is going to look higher in value, and the tooth is going to look lower in value. Again, that's why we like to see the shade tab down below and in front. There's another reference of a photo, same thing, where we cast a shadow on it. Here's an instance where we actually turn the incisal to incisal, and I have a lot of questions to ask. Do we do incisal to incisal in a photo? Do we gingival to the incisal? Honestly, there's no wrong either way. As long as you pick the right shade tab and you document it, we're going to see that through the documentation of the digital photography. Sometimes you're going to find that an incisal edge might be maybe a 1M1 and maybe the gingival part will be a 2M2. So that's where you might want to turn the incisal of the 1M1 directly to the incisal edge of the central like you see here. But when you do the gingival part, you might want to turn the gingival part up towards the incisal edge. The problem with this shade picture here is you do cut off the shade tab. Now that's okay if you make sure that you write on the RX form what shade tab this is, and you let us know that this is a, for instance, 2-in-1 shade tab that you're matching to this Natural Central. But if you don't have that documented, quite often we'll have to call the front desk and ask them what a clarification of what shade tab this is, because we don't have a reference in the photo. So again, a common mistake of that. Another thing to think about when you're taking photos is light reflection. There always has to be a light source for the camera to illuminate the oral cavity. Hence, that's what the ring flash would be for. And as you see on the central to the left, there's a large reflection area. That's from that ring flash. Now, it's going to be there. It's always going to be there because you have to have that light source. So when you take photos, as you see on the picture to the right, don't be afraid to move a little bit and move the camera to the right or to the left, or go a little higher or a little lower on that tooth, and that changes the trajectory of that flash, and it'll bounce off the tooth in different directions, which really, really helps us interpret the shade and see good shade in a photo. So keep that in mind as you're moving around. Or as you're moving to take the pictures. Quite often, because it's a digital, it's real easy to take 3 pictures of the same shade tab within 3 seconds. It's just a click, a move, a click, a move, while I'm holding that shade tab up there, because digital it's cheap. Another thought for you when you're purchasing, or maybe an add-on for your digital SLR camera, is there's items called a polarizer out there. And what you see in this video is a reference of an unpolarized photo, and you see that light reflection off the surface of the tooth. And then when you put a polarizer on there, it actually stops that light reflection. It still shows you color, so you can still reference a shade tab and take pictures of that. Now, I wouldn't say always take your photos with a polarizer. I like to see photos without a polarizer for sure, but you can add a polarizer on there with a couple photos with the shade tab and reference to block that reflection. And as you can see here, with the scrolls back and forth, the difference between a polarized photo and a non-polarized photo, and it's just an add-on to your camera. So it's a really nice feature that if you want to check into that with your camera provider. So here again, I'm going to reference back to that camera that I showed earlier. So you have the SLR camera. This happens to be a Canon. This is a twin flash, so it's got a flash on either side. It's a little bit more expensive flash. The other ones have just a ring flash that are in dead center. It's one flash all the way around the lens. But more importantly, what I'm trying to show here is the polarize. That polarize is what I'm talking about, that little white piece that goes over top the lens and over top the flash. Those are literally held on by magnets onto the lens and onto the flash. And it's a couple $100 add-on that you literally just click on or click off to be able to create that polarization effect. So might be something that you want to check into from your provider. And again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to call. Now, Photomed has no idea that I'm doing this. I've promoted Photomed for many, many years, only because they specialize in digital photography for the dental world. Very good people. You pay a little bit more from them versus just going on to B&H Photo and buying your own items, but the advantage you have is they set it up for photography. I get doctors sending me cameras all the time asking me to set them up for them because they went to Walmart, Kmart, bought a camera, bought the lens, but it doesn't take good pictures, basically because they didn't custom function set it up under the AV mode to make it simple to take photos. And Photomed sets the cameras up, and the good part is if your camera ever goes bad, you do need to send in a repair. If you drop it, something bad happens, you can send it back into Photomed, and they'll give you a loaner for free while your camera is being repaired, which is kind of a nice advantage. Again, I get no recourse off of this. There is no funding to me. I just wanted to give a source for you guys to reach out if you want to buy a camera, and they'll help you pick that proper camera. Personally, you saw all settings for a Canon. I'm a favorite of Canon only because that's what I've always had. Creatures of habit. Doesn't make Nikon a bad camera by any means. I'm just very comfortable. And if you're asking for Dental Crafters support and you call me and reference and ask for how I can help you be successful with cameras, my knowledge base is kind of on the Canon side of things. So I hope this helped, and I hope that you have found a better way to pick a proper shade, a better way to document that shade. And that's our real reason that Dental Crafters started the DC Academy, is to help you be successful. So thank you for watching our Dental Crafters DC Academy video. Continue to visit our YouTube channel for more educational videos. Have a good day.